right, we are going to do this polar bear that I pulled up off of Pixabay. Here's the picture that I printed out. I have played around with the colors, saturation, bumped up contrast, and did some things to change it a little bit from the way I originally found it on that site. But I really liked how the blues kind of came out in this, and that is what made me want to paint it. So, and I do love the dark background against the white polar bear. So we're going to just have to jump right in and be bold. Sometimes the starting point is a little bit challenging because you're kind of going into an unknown thing. Watercolor is unpredictable, and that's what makes it magical and fun. So enough said about that. I'm going to start out with a few colors that I think are going to work for this background. I have done a little swatch here with Ultramarine Turquoise, which is a Daniel Smith color. I just got a new tube of it. Really love this color. And I also have a little touches of Cobalt Teal Blue in there with some Cobalt Blue and Burnt Umber. So I'm going to play around with those colors for the background, and this has to be done quickly. So that's why sometimes it's hard for me to start, because I know that once I put my brush down there, there's no stopping until I've finished the area that I want to paint. And that can be a little bit scary. So enough of that, I'm going to mix up some color here. I want to get a good amount of paint mixed up on my palette that's going to be dark enough. What I plan to do is get the background wet, so the paint that I put into that wet area has to be a little bit thicker, or it's going to dry too light. So that is what I need to think about. And here's my messy palette, just a dinner plate from Fred Meyer. Here's that Ultramarine Turquoise, and I've got a pretty big area. I can stop here, so I know there's a stopping point. I plan to kind of lose an edge in here, so I'm not going to worry about this bottom part for the right now. I'm going to focus on getting this upper part painted and dark enough, and then worry about the rest of it after that. So real thick here. Real thick so far. And I want to make sure that I get a big enough amount of that. Don't want to run out. I don't want to stop and have to mix. And I'm going to grab another paintbrush actually, because I don't want to rinse all that color off of my brush. But I do want to start a puddle of this burnt umber. So I might just work with two brushes. That's something I really haven't done before, but I've seen other artists do it. This is burnt sienna right here, so I'm not too worried about whether or not that gets in my little mixture here. And I think I will rinse my brush and get a puddle of the Cobalt Teal ready to go. So I'm not mixing them together on the palette for a reason, because there is something really cool about letting your watercolor paint mix on the paper. You get all kinds of just really amazing effects that you couldn't get if you mixed those colors together on the palette. They just do some magical things. So that's why I am mixing up puddles. I don't really know if you can see that so much. Probably not. So I'll bring it over here just for the moment. Here's my burnt umber, cobalt teal, and then ultramarine there in the center. And now comes the part where you have to be brave. Okay, I decided to grab this small palette here that I have laying around. So that way I can get a lot of this. I'm just going to add some water, keep on adding my cobalt teal. And I really should have that covered up, but I'm just going to hope that I don't drip on it. So there's quite a bit of that cobalt teal blue there. Rinse my brush real quick, and I'm going to grab this other brush and just grab that whole pile that I had mixed up before. I'm just going to bring that on over. You see how thick that is? It's very, very thick and inky even. It's just like a glop of it on there. And it's okay that it's that thick, because when I put it into that wet area, it's going to spread out, and you'll see what I'm saying. So here's the burnt umber. Bring that over. I should have done that ahead of time, just thought ahead and made sure to have an area that I could get big puddles. And fresh paint is better because it's really hard to get enough paint mixed up for this kind of thing from dry paint. You have to work with it so much to get enough paint to cover the area. So it's just best to go with fresh. And starting with clean water, paper towel in hand to help control that water. I'm going to put this over here. I'm right-handed, so if my palette's over here, I'll drip potentially, and I don't want that to happen. So starting off, here we go. We're just going to get this paper wet. I can see the sheen. I don't want it to be puddly, but I want there to be enough water on my paper so the paint flows into it. So just keeping an eye on that sheen, making sure there's not puddles forming. I've got the tip of this brush so I can go kind of up to the edge of the bear. And I'm going to go right into the arm there. And my board is on a slant, so the water is tending to stop right where the line is there because I didn't bring the moisture down into the bear. I want to leave that nice and crisp. So I'm going to go back over this, make sure that I've got every area has still got a sheen on it. If you go over it a couple of times, it helps that moisture to soak into the paper. Arches is really like a sponge. It really soaks up the water. So I want to make sure that I don't have any areas that are losing their sheen. And there's just enough water on there. So I think I'm going to start off with grabbing a little bit more moisture on my brush, and I've got burnt umber, and I'm just dipping in to my ultramarine blue. Same thing. I even think I want some darker color in there, which I'm not sure. Maybe Prussian blue as I'm thinking about it. I'll put some of that over here. How about? Very dark blue. While this is still wet, we need to get that in there. And then I'm going to add some more burnt umber. Prussian blue, I'm going to come down with that. I'm really honestly just flying by the seat of my pants on this because I really haven't practiced it. Yeah, now I want some Cobalt Teal to pop in there. Very thick here. It's very, very thick. I'm going to come right up to Polar Bear's head. And then I'm tipping this board because a lot of that paint is just puddling here. More burnt umber. Prussian blue. I'm not rinsing my brush in between here. So far I have not. More of the turquoise. That ear is a little bit hard to get around with that big brush, so I just grabbed my little small brush, and it's got a nice tip on it. This is a Princeton Velvet Touch Long Round 6. Let's bring that right in there, right up against here. I'll bring in some more of that turquoise. And some of that teal. That's really nice in there. And I just grabbed a Utrecht. I think that's a 6. I've used it so much that it's worn the name off and the size, but I like the softness of this. And I just grabbed some cobalt blue here. I'm going to come right down along that fur. Grab some more of that burnt umber. Just going to tip this around a little bit, get some flow going. It's starting to dry out in here. As I hold it up to the light, I can see this has lost its sheen. And big brush there, so I can add in some big strokes without making a mess. More blue up here. Want it to be a little bit further back looking, so the cooler colors recede, warmer colors come forward. I'm going to drop in a little bit of Cobalt Teal. I really like that, so I want to add more. It's really wet. This whole thing is super duper wet. which is good, but it's going to take a bit to dry. So once I'm happy with where it's at, I'll set it aside and let it dry before I really go into the next step. Very juicy cobalt teal. Just going to let that flow around a little bit. Just kind of moving that paint around a little bit with my brush. Okay, so this is very wet, like I've said, and I am going to have to basically babysit this. It's going to have to be watched to make sure weird puddles aren't forming. So I can sit and tip it around. Get some of that paint to flow off in different directions. So right here is a groove that I don't want to have do anything weird. So, and by weird, I mean it'll dry at different rates. This is going to dry way slower because of how wet it is. So I need to make sure that that doesn't happen, and I'm just going to actually get some movement there with a little bit of water. Kind of get it out of that. A lot of paint in there. And this is kind of the unpredictable part. I did not plan on doing it this way, but that's kind of how it's ended up. Which is the fun, magical part of watercolor. It is fun, unpredictable. I think I want a little bit more blue in there. See how drippy that is? Let's get some of that flowing down in there. And as I'm looking at this right here, I don't want to add any more water in there or paint in there. So I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt and see what happens. Just closer to the bear. That I think I'll leave alone. Keep it moving. This still needs to have a little bit of flow. And there's still moisture here, so I think that it'll keep coming down if I just tip it. As I tip it up higher, that's flowing down. And I need to clean that up before it goes into the paper. Don't even mind that so much right here. I'm going to use a dry brush to just gently scoot that over a little bit. So by doing it with a dry brush, I'm not putting any more moisture into the paper, so it should be fine. Pretty cool effect, I must say. I'm gonna just come in, soften that a little bit. Hesitate to add anything more into that, but I might just touch in a tiny bit of water right at the bottom of that. Thirsty, thirsty brush. Tipping my paper so it's not going back up. The gravity is helping it to come back down. And just lifting a little bit of it. I'm getting close to being able to just let this dry. Thirsty, thirsty brush right here, just to slightly bring that puddle. And I think I want to soak up just a little bit. Just stick my brush in there, soak a little bit up, and then what's around will kind of fill in. Lots of water. Can you see how much moisture is on the paper? So much moisture. Okay, so I think we should be good in letting this sit and dry. Yes, I'm going to make that call. I think that anything that has settled is already as far as it's going to go, so I don't anticipate those puddles getting any deeper by walking away and letting it dry. And before I walk away from this, I do want to add that granulating paint, you stop the process of that granulating effect so much by blowing it with a hair dryer or a heat gun or anything like that. So I would wait until this is a lot drier before I finish it up with a hair dryer, just because of that. You stop the magic from happening when you decide to use a hair dryer at this stage of the game. So I'm not going to do that for that reason, although this is, I'm not sure I'm liking how that's looking, so I'm just going to touch out a little bit with my paper towel. It's just a little too mucky looking. So a little bit of paper towel soaking that up, and I think I like that better already. Yeah. Okay. We're going to let it dry, come back and see what magic happened. This is still drying. I did this off camera and I didn't like there was a hard line that was forming for that ear. And so I really carefully lifted some of the color. I'll be able to go back and hopefully save the edge of that because it's pretty sunlit here. But I just wanted to do that before it completely dries. So I just did want to show you that I did that. Also, I've decided to come in to some of these areas where there's blue and just get that wet and drop in a little bit. I'm thinking cobalt blue mixed with that cobalt teal blue. And that way when I come back over with probably raw sienna, burnt umber, and something to neutralize that a little bit, probably a purple of some sort, that blue will already be there and it won't mingle and turn green, because that's what's going to happen if you mix raw sienna in any kind of blue. So I'm going to grab my little swatch paper here and just get an area wet and see what happens with that combination. And I think I do like the two together, maybe a little bit heavier on the cobalt blue than on the teal. I could also see what happens if I mix them together on my palette and then put them on the paper. So there's going to be a little bit of a difference there. This one where I dropped in each color separately, they're mixing on the paper, which is kind of nice. Separating, you can see they're both going to separate some. So I do like, I think I want to go more with that one, just to give it more interest. So let's take a look at the bear. And I'm going to start here. And maybe I'll start over here since I'm right-handed. I don't want to drag my paint hand through the paint. But I think I also see a little touch of pink in there. So I think if I add maybe some Quinacradone Magenta or Quinacradone Violet, just a touch of that to kind of add a little bit of a tinge of a violet look. I always put too much out on my palette, especially of a red like that. So don't need very much of it because it's such a powerful color. And then, so that's the cobalt teal, and here's my cobalt blue. Oh, I wasn't going to do it that way. Well, I am now. So I've got a violet. I've got my cobalt teal. There's a little bit of a weird color in there. I think it's from the binder that's in that. And then my cobalt blue over here. Don't need a whole lot over here, so I'm just gonna get an area wet just right up to where his jawline kind of is. I'm not going to bring the color all the way up into there. Just very slightly dropping that in. Here and there. Some of that violet, very watered down. And I'm going to just, ooh, I like that. I like that look. I'm going to just kind of swish it around a little bit. A little more, I like that teal in there. That's kind of a cool look. So it's very, very slight. Probably barely be able to see it once it's dry, but you can always go back over if you wanted to. So this is a little bit in the shadow here, a little bit more away from, turned away from the light. And again, I'm just rinsing my brush and pulling some of those colors. I don't want to mess with it too much though. I just added a touch of the burnt umber and just right into the corner. Into his fur, like that. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that. And leave it. So then let's come over to his leg here. And there is same thing. There's touches of the blue, teal, and kind of magenta color. So I'm going to add that more magenta over in the shadow. I didn't quite get the water outside of that edge enough, so I just rinsed my brush off and put a little bit more water in there. Okay, same thing over here. Grabbing some more of that cobalt blue, touching it in. We're just going to let those soften. Same thing happened over here. Didn't quite come far enough with that water. So I want to drop the color in and not have it stop, but let it flow and soften. So if the water is further out here, there's more room for it to do that. And we're going to just touch in a little bit of that cobalt. And leave that alone. Come down here. I'm paying attention as well to this light area here. There's light, and then it's shadowy. So this is turned away from the light. This has the sunlight hitting it. So this is going to be cooler and a little bit darker in color than the outside edges or the sunlit side. So all those little nuances are super important. I'm going to just soften this edge right there. Okay, so more cobalt blue just up in here. It's wet all the way down to the fur line, or to the edges of his fur. A little teal. Just dropped it in, and then I'm lifting out some of it. And a little bit of that violet, just deep in there. Be careful not to get too nitpicky about it. Keep on dabbing, you end up ruining some of that effect that I'm trying to go for. Right around his claw here. And this I didn't get wet, but it's smaller, so I can just come up and soften. And again, I'm just touching in these colors as I go, just to give it the variety it needs. Softening that, softening that. And I'm going to come right. That's pretty important little line right there. So I want it to be a harder edge right there. And come down in here. This right here. Light area in between. And I'm gonna come right along that and soften it because it's like actually got a light area, light white, but I don't want it to be a hard edge. So also right under his nose, I'm gonna do a little bit of that violet, a little bit of cobalt, a little bit more of that violet. And same, just up in here a little bit, adding some depth while it's still wet. All right, I super like that. And now I think is a good time to take a step back. And even as I say that, I grabbed some Ultramarine. I think that was French Ultramarine actually. And a little bit more violet. Okay, good time to step back and see how it's looking from a distance. Let this dry even further and then see if that salt did anything. I don't know if it will or not. It might leave a couple of specks. Anyway, so we're going to stop and let it dry and come back after a bit. I'm really liking how this is looking so far. This is all completely dry, so I can scrape that salt off. See if it did anything. Just an old credit card. And just kind of push it off of there. And it did. I mean, there's some speckles in there. Nothing overpowering, but it just kind of broke it up a little bit so it wasn't so heavy in that area, which is really what I was going for. So now I want to do some more in the fur here, and what I'll do is grab some raw sienna, and I want to show you this because it's very interesting. I've mentioned before that most of the time there's differences, whether big or small, in between different brands with the same color name. So we've got two raw siennas here. One's a Holbein, Daniel Smith in my other hand. And even the tube, you can see just a little bit of a difference. But if I put them out here on my palette, you're going to really notice it. And I'm going to use, for the most part, I'm going to go with the Holbein, because it's just a little more leaning toward the yellow side. This Daniel Smith, as you'll be able to see, is just a little bit more on the brownish side, I guess. They're both raw sienna, but there's a difference in the colors. So if you see somebody using a particular color and you go, oh, I have that color, and then it doesn't look the same, maybe that's why. So I'm going to do the raw sienna, and I think what I'll use for my purple, because purple is going to gray down the raw sienna. I could mix it up like I did here, which would be fine, but I do have this mineral violet that I'm just going to put out here just to make it a little bit easier. I won't need much of it, but it does neutralize that color. So for instance, in the shadows, it's going to be not as bright as it would be on the sunnier side. So I'm going to start by getting this number 8 Velvet Touch. I love these brushes, by the way, the Princeton Velvet Touch. They're very good price point. They have a good tip on them. They have got a good spring to them, hold a lot of paint and water. So you don't have to go out and spend just a ton of money on your brushes. It's a good brush line, good price point. And the thing is, when you're first starting out in watercolor, it's really easy to tell yourself you don't need to spend a lot of money, which in a lot of ways you don't need to spend an exorbitant amount, I should say. But there's a few things that, man, you just do so much better. You'll be so much less frustrated if you're using good brushes and good paper. Those two things, especially the paper. I remember when I first started painting in watercolor, and I didn't know. I just grabbed a student grade, whatever, watercolor paper and started painting, and it was frustrating. Now looking back, I understand why, because paper that is not 100% cotton is so much harder to paint on. They buckle more, they lift easier, which in some ways it's nice to have a paper that lifts easier, but when you don't want it, your paint to lift, and you're going over a wash and the paint underneath doesn't stay put, it's very frustrating. And that's what happens with student grade watercolor paper a lot of times. So here's my Holbein raw sienna here, and here is my, I'll just put them, so I'll probably use both of them, because I mean there's a place for both of them. But I don't want it that bright. I want it grayed down a little bit. So just by adding a touch of that mineral violet, I get it more toned down. Because if you look at the picture, it isn't bright yellow. It's a toned down, more neutral color. So that was a little too much mineral violet. So I'll just add in a little bit more raw sienna. Now my paint is getting thicker as I add more paint to that puddle there. And I'm not going to want it quite that saturated. So I'm going to start off on, I think I'll start over here. I want to preserve this area that's more in the sunlight, so I'm just going to come like I did with the blue. And actually, I do like a little bit of that Quinacradone magenta there with it. Just for some of the warmer areas. And also, I'm not going to want to get this area too dark because it needs to stand out from this, which is going to be the darker of the two areas. So I'm going to kind of stay away from the edges like I did with the blues. But I do want to extend that water out so I have a soft edge. And I'm not going to necessarily, I'm going to tell myself I'm not going to be too fussy about the detail in the fur. I just want to get some color in. A little bit more. I think I actually am going to need some raw sienna, or not raw sienna, burnt umber and cobalt blue to that mix. That was the right there, just because there's some areas that are definitely more in shadow. Right up to the chin there. Chinny chin chin. I'm just going to extend that, soften that. I don't want that too hard of an edge because I'm going to come back. I'm just going to come right up into that. Soften that. I didn't have time to really think that through, so I don't want to do anything there before I think on it. Ponder my path. I'm going to keep coming in here with some more water. It was kind of starting to dry out. A little bit more cobalt blue. Flick my brush a little bit. See, it's really hard not to think about doing texture. I don't want to get all caught up in that. A little of the pink here. I rinsed my brush. I do that often, where I rinse the brush and then I'll come pull and soften from the paint that I just put down. So there's some of the burnt umber, a little bit more cobalt blue. Using some of the body of that brush to bring in some of the bigger strokes there. Important to use all of your brush. I didn't like this straight line here. It's a little compositional thing, so I kind of smoothed that out by doing some directional strokes with my brush. So I like that. Let's come down into here. Same thing. I'm going to get it wet. Cobalt blue, burnt umber, a little bit more cobalt blue, maybe a touch of the magenta. So remember, this is turned away from the light. Just gonna touch in, brush in, let it spread. Rinse my brush, come back over that and pick some of that up. More of the burnt umber and cobalt. While that's still wet enough. Soaking off some of my moisture. Pulling that paint up and down. And then leaving it. Okay, so I like that. I'm going to leave that as is. I'm going to come up in here. Right up to the edge there. And this is going to have a little bit more of a pink glow. With that raw sienna. Watered down. I'm just going to bring that not right up to the edge. I brought the water up to the edge, but I'm just letting that paint flow in there. Like it needs a little bit more pink. I don't want it to get too dark because once the other colors are around it, I want it to have a glow. And I like that softness right there, so that's a good thing. And just bringing that on past, because this is going to be darker. I don't need to worry about a hard edge if I do that. And then I'm just going to touch in with the tippy tip of my brush some more raw sienna into that. Lift out just a little bit. All right, I'm going to leave that alone, let it dry. Come over here to the front paw. And I'm bringing the water right up against that fur, but I'm going in with the tip of my brush so that there's texture there where that fur is. And then I'm gonna get this wet. Just seems to be working very well. So I think I'll go right past that because that can be a nice little lost edge there. Okay, so cobalt blue, burnt umber, and I think I'm going to add a touch of that permanent violet and come right along the edge. Kind of give myself, see if I can't do that. That was a little of the mineral violet, burnt umber, raw sienna. A little bit more raw sienna, kind of in the little crook of his paw. Come right here, I've rinsed my brush, just lifting some of that so there's not a hard edge. And you can see that it's not turning green because that blue underneath has dried. And I'm following the feeling of the way the fur is growing as well. I'm getting more cobalt blue and raw umber, or burnt umber, excuse me, and just actually I think I want to come down this way. When I go up this way, when I lift my brush, it leaves a little speck. So if I start there with the tip of my brush, it doesn't happen like that so much. Okay, that looks good. Let's do a little bit more burnt umber. And then again, I've rinsed my brush and I want to come right along that and just soften that edge so it doesn't look funky. Liking that. I like the feel of it, the softness of it. And I love the way this is granulating in here. I'll zoom in. Let's see if I can do that now. It's not. Just right in here, it's starting to really get a nice little granulation. The water kind of is pushing back into that, but it's giving it a really nice texture that I like. So I'm going to leave that alone so it'll dry like that. Good idea. Zoom back out. There we go. Okay, so that's a little harder of an edge that I really want, but I think I can work with that anyway. This is still wet. I don't want to work on this until both of those areas are dry. So I'm just going to let it dry for a minute and then come back and work on some of this other stuff around it.